Welcome, one and all, to Witness Titanic, the podcast inquiry where we call witnesses of Titanic's great story, from modern experts to even the survivors of the sinking. Through their testimony, we navigate the uncertain waters of the Titanic legend, uncover what actually happened in April of 1912, and ultimately witness Titanic ourselves. This podcast is very clearly inspired by the United States Senate inquiry and the United Kingdom's Wreck Commissioner's Court. These two investigations primarily called the survivors of the sinking to learn exactly what happened on board Titanic from the people who were there, something we focus on as well on Witness Titanic. But the original inquiries also brought in valuable witnesses in other fields, for example, wireless telegraphy experts, a geologist to discuss icebergs, and even a hydrographer, which I didn't even know was a job. Well, today on Witness Titanic, we are going to follow suit with an expert of a very different subject from what we are used to. But before we call this historian to the stand, let's go on a little trip. In your mind, step off Titanic. Don't board her in Southampton, as we have done many times on this podcast. Board another ship. How about the Olympic? Cross the Atlantic in one piece, arrive safely at Pier 59 in New York City, and what now? In all your life as someone who has loved the Titanic story, have you ever thought what would come after Titanic? What would you do? You're in New York City in 1912, no disaster to speak of. Where do you go if not St. Vincent's Hospital to recover from nervous shock? Well, you could go see a baseball game, but the next baseball game in New York isn't until the 20th, when the Giants play the Dodgers. The New York Giants play the Brooklyn Dodgers, of course. It's 1912. So what do you do? Well, odds are you would have gone and seen a Broadway show. Here to lend her expertise and discuss the many connections between Broadway and the Titanic disaster, including how Titanic inadvertently created one of the first female Broadway producers, we call to testify the leading Broadway historian in this world and an old friend of mine, Jennifer Ashley Tepper. Jen, thank you so much for joining our little investigation here. How are you?
I'm so good, and I'm so honored you asked me to do this. I can't believe I get to talk to you about the Titanic. It's very exciting.
Well, I'm excited I get to talk about Broadway with you. I mean, we've done that many times, and I'm sure we've talked about Titanic in the past as well. But in fact,
not this deep yet.
That's true. We never devoted time to it. Before we dive in, I do want to explain to my listeners why we know each other, because I didn't just think like, oh, I know what we can do. We'll talk about my history as an actor combining with Titanic, but we actually go way, way, way back. And I thought, I have historians on this podcast all the time, but they're Titanic historians or ocean liner historians. So a Broadway historian will fit right in. So we met in 2011, if you recall.
God. 15 years ago.
Yeah, I believe you came to Weston, Vermont to see me and a bunch of college kids sing the music of Joe Iconis, a great friend of yours and a great friend of mine now. But back then we were just singing his music, and Joe and you and Jason and a bunch of people came up to see us. And I remember being in college and thinking, Joe Iconis, the musical theater writer who has now written a Broadway show, but at the time hadn't yet. But we were so excited that his friends were all there and you guys were there, and I remember seeing you guys sitting at the table and hoping we did a good job. And do you remember coming to see that show at all?
I totally remember it. And, every time that I feel like Joe works with students, or that I do sometimes, we're like, oh my God, we need to work more with that person. And you were definitely one of those people where we were like, who's that guy? I remember that performance. It was really special. I also realized as you were talking that there's like a Joe Iconis, George Salazar 2-player game ad in the background.
Yeah.
So he looms large.
Yes,
and I'm
does.
So glad we met through like Joe's stuff, and then doing the Joe Iconis Christmas show for
That's
so many
right.
years.
So 2 years after we met, I moved to New York City after college to be on Broadway. And Joe emailed me and said, hey, I do a Christmas show every year. would you want to come just like stand in the background and sing? And I said, sure. And then 7 years in a row, I did that show. How many years have you done it now?
Oh my God, so 15.
Yeah, that's crazy. That Christmas show was the most fun thing to do. It meant so much to everybody in it. And YouTube viewers, I'll put some pictures on the screen of us in that show, and I'll put them on Instagram or something for everybody else. But yeah, it meant the world to me. And then the last time I did it was 2019. COVID happened, so it got canceled for a year or two. And I moved out of New York, and I'm dying to come back and see it and just cry the whole time because I'll miss it so much. But I'm glad it's still going.
It's such an extraordinary tradition, and it's also like kind of a rep company, as you know, like you played multiple roles over the years, and having people that have done it come back, like you guys have to come back and see it. It's so special. Yeah. It's hard to describe for people who don't know what it is, but if you're listening to this and haven't seen it, come see it.
Yeah, I mean, to give you an idea of how insane it is, the list of roles that I have played in this show include my first year I played a mythical-looking snow creature, then Mr. Jensen Meyer, I guess, angry neighbor who wants the music to quiet down. I've also played Sweet Baby Jesus, and then the greatest role in theater history, Mr. Maccabee, the old-timey barkeep.
I like how the greatest role is not Sweet Baby Jesus, it's Mr. Mac.
Mr. Maccabee was always my favorite, and then 4 or 5 years into my time doing that show, I got to play him, and that was great. And I hear he had a new song this year.
He has an amazing new song. It's always changing, as you know very well. But it's so funny to me that this show that features classic Christmas characters and all of these people from stories that we love coming to life, the person that gets the most entrance applause, maybe it's tied, but it's Santa and Mr. Maccabee.
Yeah, Santa Claus and Mr. Maccabee
is an invention.
It's spectacular. He deserves his own full show. Okay, so we know each other. We go way back. Very honored to be a friend of yours and to have worked with you and performed that show with you. But let's talk about Titanic a little bit. So my listeners are probably like, what could this possibly have to do with Titanic? This might be a stretch. James just wants to talk about theater. Not so much. So in prep for this episode, I was thinking about it, and I couldn't believe how many connections Broadway and ocean liners in particular have in common. I feel like they share a similar rise and fall through history, the 1800s, like the forming of theater. Oh, and I should specify, a lot of people think, a lot of Broadway theater people, when we say Broadway, you're imagining big musicals. Broadway, of course, goes way before then, when it was mostly plays and other things. Musicals, as we know them today, didn't come around until the mid 1900s, like musicals we think about. But Broadway really had its heyday, and I imagine the 1800s into the 1900s. Like when would the peak of Broadway be? Like when were the most Broadway theaters running at once?
It's a good question. So Broadway really became synonymous with theater in New York around the time of the Civil War, when railroads started bringing Broadway shows all around the country. And the way that you would know that it was a really good show was that they would say straight from Broadway, and that kind of meant straight from New York. So we started calling it Broadway around like Civil War, railroads, technology expanding era. But theater's been going on in Manhattan since, the beginning of time. And as we know it since, the European settlers and immigrants came over. And the theater district has moved slowly uptown, and we'll get to the history that intersects with the Titanic there. But it's always been happening, since Manhattan was founded.
That's spectacular. And it's that same Industrial Revolution, Civil War, railroads in the United States. It's the same time ocean liners are also really picking up steam, literally. And so they grew and grew and grew. And then we get into the 1900s when, especially listeners to this podcast know, ocean liners really peaked around that time, because that's when immigration to the United States was really peaking. I think 1907 or 1910 was the biggest year of immigration, and so the demand for ships was super intense. And then the Great Depression kind of killed both ocean liners and Broadway. And then new technology killed both even more, in that movies began to replace the stage, and literally these Broadway theaters are becoming movie theaters. And then, air travel completely annihilated the need for ocean liners, though Broadway did experience a comeback that ocean liners would never experience, because we literally don't need them. There's only one transatlantic ocean liner left. The Cunard company. They
Yeah.
have the Queen Mary 2. It's the only one that does a transatlantic voyage now, which is absurd. But Broadway experienced a comeback, and now there's still quite a few theaters that have Broadway shows, but not nearly as much as maybe back in the heyday.
Yeah, what's interesting about that though, and there's so many like measurements that could tell us how successful Broadway is, and
Hmm.
also just so many ways that like things have changed. But even though it seems like there were way more Broadway theaters 100 years ago, there were a lot of theaters that were considered Broadway back then would kind of be considered off Broadway today. So there's so many off Broadway theaters now, and shows run for so much longer now because of the way that the finances work. So even though you might go, oh my God, there were 100 Broadway theaters then, and now there's 41. A lot of those shows in the 100 theaters back then ran for 2 weeks, and now we have
Wow.
shows that run for a really long time. So
Yeah.
there's different like measures of success. But what you're talking about like the history of like technology and movies and like all of that, it really pulls together Broadway and Titanic history, actually.
Yeah, I was looking up numbers just for my own, and you can tell me if these are crazy wrong, but um, just to relate it to Titanic, between 1901 and 1920, so this is like primo Titanic time, um, 43 brand new Broadway theaters were built during that time. And right now, how many theaters are even still open at this point?
Yeah.
Like
So
around
there's
that?
41 current Broadway theaters, but our oldest continually operating Broadway theater is the Lyceum, which opened in 1903, and the Hudson, which is the theater we'll talk about that ties
Hmm.
into Titanic history, also opened in 1903. So our oldest existing Broadway
Wow.
theaters, are those from that year. But between, 1900 and the Great Depression, there were so many theaters built, and then obviously there were a lot of years where we used those theaters, but we didn't build new ones very much.
Yeah. And then in 1912, the year of our Titanic,
Mhm.
there were I counted this, so this is out completely a guess based on just like I don't know what the Broadway database. I saw a list of at least 160, and this goes back to what you just said about how shows closed much quicker. It's not quite like today, but 160 different shows opened in 1912, the year
Right.
that people are traveling on Titanic. While today, because shows run longer, there's not as many theaters. Like how many shows open a season nowadays?
Right. Not as many at all, but it's interesting because like that the 1912, the Titanic era was before off Broadway or off Broadway. Any theater in New York would be considered like Broadway back then, basically.
Oh,
So
okay.
it is like we would have to really count the off Broadway shows, which I think you might get a similar
Yeah.
stat. I'd be really interested, to spend some time doing it. I also it's the history of New York. It intersects with the history of real estate because, as I mentioned, like theater Broadway started at the lower tip of Manhattan and the theater district started like moving up. And there was no second thought to demolish a Broadway theater, build a new one. And then around that early 1900s Titanic era, when the theater district became centralized around what's now known as Times Square, it became more permanent. Like the idea of like, let's keep these theaters. These are our theaters. A lot of construction of Upper Manhattan was happening that made it not possible to keep moving, northward and northward. And it was, there were so many things. The New York Times moved to Times Square. The subway happened, and
Mm.
started changing the way we, move people around. So the theater district becoming more permanent also kind of changed the patterns as far as like, yeah, let's build 20 new Broadway theaters this season. Maybe one will be over here, one will be down
Yeah,
there.
sure.
It sort of just started becoming solidified.
It kind of goes back to what I'm saying, that Broadway and these ocean liners have this relation, because I bet that people who research long lost ocean liners would love to talk to you about long lost theaters, because
Theater.
there's this similar
Similar.
vibe that we celebrate their architecture. They have these stories of people who were once there, people who
Mhm.
once sailed on this ship or that ship. And then in sort of shows as well, in the theater world, we look back at great flops, shows that closed in a night or closed in a week or 2 weeks. There are people in my community in the Titanic world who obsess over ships that sank on maiden
Yep.
voyages or sank in the first month. And then on the flip side, we celebrate great musicals of our time, Oklahoma and Sondheim shows and whatever. And there are people who celebrate the great ocean liners of the world. And in the same way that I bet I could tell you, if I could jump in a time machine, what ocean liner would I go back to sail on, I bet you have a show that you would go back in time to see. Do you have
Yeah.
and while we're on that topic, if you had a time machine, what opening night would you go back to?
Oh, It's a great question because sometimes I think it would be The Black Crook, which is sort of apocryphally the first musical. And it goes back to
Sure.
what you were talking about. It was kind of the first time that a lot of these art forms, ballet and drama, like collided and sort of has become like, oh, is that the first musical? Who knows? It might be something like Oklahoma or a chorus
Yeah.
line. But I think also what you're saying that hits home so much is like the walls tell stories, both in Broadway theaters and on these ocean liners. And
Hmm.
it's so much about like who was there then and then who was there later. Just a lot of basically like history of people, but being told through physical spaces.
Yeah. And what year abouts is the Black Crook? I have a point to make on this.
Yeah, 1870s, although 1860s, sorry.
1860s, and for our ocean liner listeners, the first, so that was the first ever musical. Some people think, depending on what you consider a musical, but so 1860s, the first ever ocean liner. Depending on, again, it's a similar thing. Like, what is an ocean liner? Sort of what people kind of agree. The first ever ocean liner is the Oceanic of 1870. So
Wow.
the first ever musical and the first ever ocean liner sort of are like 4 or 5 years apart, which is
Yeah.
nutty. That's so
I think the
cool.
technology was definitely like impacting each other. The
Hmm.
other thing, and this is not, I know directly what we're talking about, but like stagehands had their roots on ships. And that's why I think it's always so interesting. Like backstage, it sometimes looks like a old ship because there's like how we handle the systems, like the ropes and the pulleys and all of that. And
Wow.
so there's also like there were so many people who worked in New York theaters but had started out on the docks. And it's like, so there's definitely some intersection of like human, like, efforts from that era going both ways too.
That's amazing. And speaking of direct connections like that, I was also thinking about, like, yeah, we're talking very like, oh, the ocean liners are like a time capsule of the time, and so are Broadway theaters and shows even. But literally, Gilbert and Sullivan, who, from what I remember, had their first show on Broadway in like the late 1800s, the music of Gilbert and Sullivan was played by Titanic's orchestra on Titanic. And
Mhm.
Lawrence Beasley, a survivor of Titanic, he makes a Gilbert and Sullivan reference, if not a joke, in his book about Titanic. But even more directly, I find this very funny. We're here to talk about Titanic and Broadway. The White Star Line offices that survivor or passenger families would have gathered around for answers the following morning. Like, everyone's hearing Titanic sank, they'd all go to the White Star Line offices and sort of demand to know what's going on. That office that people have seen a photo of the crowds outside, that was at 11 Broadway. So literally, the White Star Line offices was on the
On
actual
Broadway.
street of
That's
Broadway.
sweet.
Yeah, and then I love looking this stuff up because, and this is something else that I know we both love, is the show Mad Men.
Hmm.
There's an episode where Roger's daughter gets married the day after JFK is assassinated, and that's just like such a thing. Like, oh my gosh, yeah, somebody would get married the next
Hmm.
day because they have no choice. So of course I looked up what Broadway shows opened on April 15th.
Hmm.
So the day after this terrible tragedy, the city of New York would have been like walking around with such, I mean, we experienced that a lot with other tragedies in our own lifetime, where a whole city can just be in shock of something. So I looked it up, and there's two shows that opened on April 15th. So I feel so terrible for these casts and crews and producers who, oh, what a night to open on Broadway. A show called Dear Old Charlie and a show called The Wall Street Girl. I think
Ooh, I
that's
have
just
to look
funny.
up more about both of those and also how they like did they mention it or did they,
Yeah,
anything
I
like
would love to know. I do. All I do know is the people we'll talk about here in a second, that at least a few theaters closed for
Mhm.
one night in honor of losing
Yeah.
their Broadway producer. But yeah, I'd love to know. Dear Old Charlie was in a theater called the Maxine Elliott's Theater,
Hmm.
and the Wall
Hmm.
Street Girl was in the George M. Cohan's Theater.
Hmm.
Kind of cool.
Yes. Two theaters both no longer with us, but one
Yeah.
does intersect a little bit more with Titanic history.
Hi there, folks. James Penca here from the future. Don't click away. This is not an advertisement. This is actually a new development in the topic that Jen and I were just talking about. So I'm coming to you weeks after I recorded this episode with Jen. I now have a cold, if you couldn't tell. But I just had to jump in here to update you on what were this exact topic of wondering what it was like to open a Broadway show the day after Titanic sank. Well, after we did this episode, Jen went into her archives, her magical room of history. I don't know how she gets this stuff, but she sent me a series of newspaper articles all written about that exact topic. And I want to read just a few sentences from one of them called "Theater Audiences Are Affected by the Great Disaster at Sea." So this can just give you an idea of what it was like if you happened to have a ticket to a Broadway show on April 15th, 1912. Even in theatricals here, the Titanic disaster made itself felt. When the performances began Monday evening, the belief was general that no lives had been lost and that there was every chance of towing the Titanic into harbor. By the time the first acts were over, the news began to spread that the favorable reports of the day were not true, and that there had been a tremendous loss of life. There was a distinct change in the attitudes of the audiences, and at the close of the performances, everyone rushed to the nearest bulletins and usual places of information. The opening performance of Dear Old Charlie was marred to some extent by the bad news which circulated through the audience. Even without that, the piece would have failed of making any pronounced impression. So how fascinating is that? If you were seeing a Broadway show on April 15th, 1912, you would have gone into the theater believing that Titanic was being towed to safety and that everyone was saved. And by the time you left the theater, you were rushing to newsstands and seeing literal victims and survivor names already being published. And then it also reviews Dear Old Charlie like nothing happened and kind of throws a little shade its way and says that even without the Titanic news, the play still wasn't very good. So absolutely fascinating. So excited I can share that with you, that Jen got that to me within like 24 hours of our interview. And so thank you to Jen for sending this. I mean, oh my gosh, how fascinating. I can only imagine the buzz in the audience as people go to their seats for Act Two. I mean, how many people didn't even stay for Act Two because the news was just too, apparently far more interesting than Dear Old Charlie. Fascinating stuff. Okay, back to the normally scheduled episode.
You know, I think a lot about where Little Island is now, that archway that's like the entrance to Little Island.
Of course.
But you could miss it if you don't know, where like, you know, the Carpathia docked, and obviously you know all of this, but the Titanic survivors, like that's where they came into New York, and now there's performances there. So it's like we're seeing like theater happening like inches from basically where they arrived in New York. And then the other thing that I've become really fascinated by is the Jane Hotel, of course, where, you know, a lot of the crew members who survived stayed there. And for years there was an off-Broadway theater there. It's where Tick Tick Boom was, and Hedwig, and like just a bunch of other shows. And now it's the hotel ballroom. But as you know well, like that hotel has been very much kept in a time capsule of sorts, and you can see a lot of the Titanic history there. And then there's also some like lost off-Broadway history there. So kind of all over the city, there are some spots that have actual visceral Titanic history you can still visit.
The largest connection of all, we will focus on now, unless there's more. Do you have more history to talk about, more connections?
Let's dive into the big one.
Let's dive in. So the biggest connection of all between Broadway and Titanic is Irene and Henry Harris. They were first-class passengers. They were married, of course, and Henry Harris was a Broadway producer, and Irene was his wife, who he apparently, according to some stuff I found, that Henry, when he was looking for his next play to produce on Broadway, he once stated that he always consulted her before accepting a play, being a firm believer in the value of a woman's point of view regarding matters theatrical. Mm-hmm. Which is a great sentence anyway. So they were this Broadway couple, the Harrises. They were in London, apparently to discuss putting on a show there that had been a success at their theater, and they were crossing on Titanic. What can you tell us about Henry and Irene Harris?
Oh my God, so much. I think this is one of the most fascinating stories in all of Broadway history. And
Amazing.
So it's like really incredible, and it intersects with obviously like important American history on the Titanic. It intersects with the history of the Broadway theaters themselves. It intersects with like women's history. But yeah, so as you said, Irene, who was largely known as Renee Harris, she occupied like a really incredible place in Broadway history because she was someone who, and I'll start at the beginning. She came from like nothing. She came from poverty. She grew up one of 9 children, and she basically had to help her mother like keep the household afloat. And so at a time, she was born in the 1870s. Shout out to what we were talking about before, 1870s history. But at the time she moved to New York in the 1890s, women were not often having these kinds of jobs, but she became a law secretary and she was going to law school at night. So she was like, you know, a very forward thinking woman in this time in New York. And she met Henry Harris when she went to go see a matinee. They like met in a theater. And, you know, fell in love, got married, and as you said, he started to consult her about like everything he did. And he came from a legacy of Broadway producers. His dad was a Broadway producer. Henry Harris not only built the Hudson Theater, which is now, you know, it's on 44th Street. It's right now got, you know, Daniel Radcliffe doing a play in it. It still stands. But he also built several other Broadway theaters that are now demolished. He produced tons of shows. He was an incredibly prominent Broadway producer. He actually was very active with what's now the Entertainment Community Fund, but was then the Actors Fund. And he was like a leader. You know, he was on all these boards, all these committees. Like he was really a center of the theater industry at the time. And so was she. And so even though women kind of like held their place, like it wasn't like she was a Broadway producer while he was alive, she was actively involved in like all of the affairs of theater that he did. And their Titanic story, I think it's cool that it has been well documented because she gave a lot of interviews about the Titanic, and, you know, she lived to be 93. So she lived this very long life where she, you know, was part of like a night to remember. She like, you know, she kept talking about the Titanic. So we have a lot of like quotes from her and things like that. But basically what happened is, you know, she broke her arm at the elbow on the Titanic. So that's part of the story. She tripped on the Titanic staircase. And you know, we'll get to that later, but basically when the ship was going down, she refused to get on a lifeboat. She was like, I am staying with my husband. You know, we've seen that in some Titanic stories, but she really refused. And at one point, I think they got her into a lifeboat and she managed to get out. She was like, I'm staying with my husband. And they reportedly, by all, you know, articles and things like that, they had an extremely happy marriage. You know, they were really a team just in the theater, but also like very happily married. And finally, they convinced her to get in the last collapsible canvas boat because they were like, if you don't get in, your husband won't be able to get in a boat either. You have to get in this one so he can get in another one. So she did get in. And then she watched her husband sink. Like she watched him perish on the Titanic, even though like a lot of survivors, and you know this better than anyone, she did retain some hope that maybe he had lived. But essentially she, you know, watched it sink into the sea because she got into the lifeboat 15 minutes before the boat did its final sinking. And then even with her like broken arm, she helped steer that lifeboat. And when she got back to New York, obviously traumatized, obviously like incredibly, you know, basically she said in interviews she doesn't remember anything about the next 2 years, like extremely traumatized. But she got back to New York and talked to her father-in-law, Henry's father, who was also a Broadway producer. And he said, based on all these debts, you should give up the Hudson, give up the theater that, like, you know, Henry built. And she was adamant that she wouldn't. And in his name, she took it over. Like this woman at a time where there were so few women, Maxine Elliott, who, you know, whose theater you named being another one, there were so few women producers, managers, theater owners, any of that. She said, in the name of my husband, who, you know, we've lost, I'm going to take over this theater. And she became this incredibly successful Broadway producer who essentially like discovered Moss Hart, discovered Barbara Stanwyck, produced so many shows that had, you know, really important things to say about American culture at the time. And to this day, you know, there's a really amazing display in the lower lobby of the Hudson about her and Henry and the Titanic history that if you go see a show there, like definitely go scope out.
Oh
like,
my God, I gotta go.
Yeah, there's all the original like articles, photos, interviews that she did about the Titanic experience. But essentially she made a lot of history from, you know, doing that. And then I think this is also like, it speaks a little bit to the Titanic survivor legacy, but they tried so hard to get her to sell the Hudson in 1928, and she still refused to sell. And then the Great Depression happened, and all of the Broadway theaters, like you touched on, really struggled to book successful shows and have long runs. And obviously, people didn't have a lot of money to go to the theater. And so the Hudson really fell on hard times during that period. And she sadly lost the theater in 1932. But if she had sold it in 1928, they would have made it into a skyscraper. Like they wanted to make it into a hotel. And it was before all the Broadway theaters were really landmarked. And so because she refused to sell it, both, when she got back from the Titanic and also in 1928, that's the only reason we have that theater today. And the theater, after it stopped being a Broadway house, it became, like you said, like a TV studio. There were a number of years where Broadway theaters weren't as in demand. It's actually a theater where Elvis played. Elvis did like Hound Dog on the Steve Allen show, and that was filmed on the set of the stage of the Hudson. So really cool, like Hudson TV history too, but it fell into disrepair. Basically in the 60s, it became, it stopped being a Broadway theater at all, and it became like a nightclub and like a blue movie theater and all these things. And then for years, it was just like the hotel event space of this hotel. But again, because of Renee Harris and her level of perseverance of keeping the theater, it never was destroyed. And then in 2017, it became a Broadway house again. And so it's kind of like this. And she lived to be 93. She stayed active in the community, and like a lot of prominent theater people credited her with like kind of believing in them when no one did and giving them opportunities. So she lived an extraordinary life. And also some other footnotes about her extraordinary life. She was married 4 times, but she said, I was married 4 times, but I only had one husband because she loved Henry so much. But yeah, the Hudson, I mean, I could talk forever about it clearly, but like the way that her history and the Hudson history and the Titanic history come together to create kind of this really American story of all of the 100 years of that is pretty fascinating.
To keep the theaters alive, that building wouldn't be there if it wasn't for her, if it wasn't, she turned down millions to sell that building right before everyone lost all their money, but it's worth it, and that's pretty great. Going back to her time on Titanic, I want to point out one of the coolest things about Irene Harris is she. Everybody who listens to this podcast knows I have a particular focus and obsession with survivor testimony. That's why this whole podcast is testimony themed. And so Irene Harris actually wrote gave an interview to the New York Evening Journal in May of 1912. And whether it's her own words or the editor of the newspaper, which we talk about this a lot on the podcast, that the editors, they take survivor testimony and they flower it up quite a bit to make it sound really nice. But Irene Harris gives my favorite testimony ever. And I like to think it's her own words because I hope it is. But also, she's a theater person, so she has the ability to be a bit flowery if she wants to be. So I'll read it to you. It's the greatest story. When people ask me, like, tell me a story about Titanic that I've never heard, and like, why are you so interested? This is it. This is what I always say. So she talks about Fred and Jane Hoyt, and I may have even told this story on this podcast already because I love it so much. But Fred and Jane Hoyt were separated at the same lifeboat that she and her husband were separated at. Collapsible D, as you said, was the last successfully launched lifeboat from Titanic. So we're talking final moments of Titanic, which, credit to Irene to stay on board with her husband till, very, very late in the sinking. So Fred and Jane Hoyt also stayed together, and finally Jane gets in the lifeboat, and they lower the lifeboat and they go out to sea. And they may never see their husbands ever again. But then Irene tells this story. When we had got farther away from the place where the Titanic sank, a man was pulled into the boat. As he lay in the bottom of the boat, he looked into the face of the woman who was rowing. Jane, he said. For a moment, she stopped rowing. Fred, she called. It was her husband. The sea had given the Hoyts back to each other. Like, what a beautiful, is that the editor adding that at the end? The sea had given back the Hoyts to each other. It's just, oh my gosh. And then I'll give you one more bit of testimony from Irene. I'm not sure where this is from, but she says, although my heart bleeds with grief over the loss of my husband, I would 1,000 times rather that he met his death as he did, standing up with those other brave men, as did the Major, than that he had come off that boat with the feeling that he had not done his duty in obeying his superior officers.
Wow. We'll never know for sure. We won't. But I do think from reading some quotes of hers later, when I think maybe editors weren't editing her so much
Mm,
because she was talking about a show rather than the Titanic, she did have that literary sense with words. So maybe we can have some faith that that
yeah.
was really her.
That's good. That's good to know. You also mentioned some of her, post-sinking things, but the one you mentioned that's super important to Titanic people, and maybe your ears perked up at home. You mentioned she launched the career of Barbara Stanwyck
Hmm.
on Broadway, and Barbara Stanwyck would then star in the 1953 movie Titanic. So she has a Titanic connection as well. And then, yeah, she died in 1969 at the age of 93.
She also, in addition to all the like interesting Hudson history that was covered, there was a memorial for Henry at the Hudson itself,
Mm,
and so like people from the theater community and people from he was like a part of the Masonic community, like a lot of people gathered. It was apparently standing room only at the Hudson for this in the week after the Titanic sunk, this memorial for him, and they played "Nearer My God to Thee" at the memorial, which
mhm.
obviously was played on board probably and is in the Titanic, the 90s Titanic film. And so that memorial probably was really like meaningful.
I'm sure. Yeah, and then the three theaters that they owned, the Fulton, the Harris, and the Hudson, they closed for the night, or I don't know which night it was, but as a memorial. Which, while Broadway theaters don't close necessarily these days, they do, like the tradition now when someone passes is they dim their lights of the marquee for people.
I
Uh,
think so. The Titanic sinking, obviously, like very specific when we talk about those three theaters were owned by someone who died. But there've been the theater closures for 9/11, the theater closures for when JFK was shot. There's certain moments like in
mm,
tragic New York City history that the Titanic counts as that I think fall under that category. Yeah, I also the Fulton is interesting because, as in addition to the Hudson, which still stands, Henry Harris was instrumental in building the Fulton, which became the old Helen Hayes Theater, which is one of the theaters that was demolished to build the Marriott Marquis in the 90s. So
mm.
that was like it was actually the first like Broadway theater that did sort of an immersive seating. It was called the Follies Bergère for a while, and they tried to, bring that to New York City. But that theater was demolished in the 80s to build the Marquis, which is what actually led to all the other Broadway theaters getting landmarked, including the Hudson. So there's these like trickles of the Harris family like in theater history even after they were gone.
That's very, very cool. Speaking of little memorial dimming of the lights for people, this happened yesterday, or at least this is something I learned of yesterday, and this is pretty crazy that this has happened. There is a Titanic author historian um, named Randy Bingham who passed away yesterday. And I just saw the news last night, or maybe it was the day before he passed away, but I saw the news last night. He is somebody who, if you go online and look up Irene Harris, Randy's name is all over that stuff. He is, and same with Lucille Duff Gordon, Randy, and Dorothy Gibson. Randy really was a specialist in diving into these like first class women's stories and telling their story, which of course don't get told enough because all we do in the Titanic world is talk about these heroic men who went down with the ship. And listeners of this podcast know that I find that side of Titanic to be very overblown and probably not even true. But he was diving into these stories, and he wrote so much about Irene Harris, and he passed away yesterday. And I thought, wow,
Wow.
how fitting that we're talking about a subject that he knew a lot about. So, to the Titanic community, go look up Randy Bingham and his research, and read a little bit about the people he wrote about. But a great researcher, and he did a lot of the research that I ended up looking at prior to this episode. So shout out to
Wow.
Randy.
Yeah, to
Yeah,
read some of his stuff. I feel like
yeah.
one of the blessings too is like with Renee Harris, Irene, she went by both names, but with her, because she lived for so long and she was so willing to talk, I feel like she did talk to quite a few Titanic historians, and she gave interviews like later in life, and like she lived so long that she lived to understand the place it would have in American history, I think. I also, this I didn't know before. I was like, oh, I'm going to refresh myself for us to chat today, that Henry Harris put a ton of her expensive of jewelry in his pockets before he sank on the Titanic.
Wow. Okay.
And I was thinking about that part of it too. Like obviously the like, it looms large because of the 90s film. But I was like, oh, there's like Renee Harris jewelry and the Titanic wreckage. There's all of these things that are real that intersect with the fictional Titanic stories. And I think that's also like very theatrical.
Oh yeah, very, very theatrical. One last kind of fun connection between Titanic and Broadway is, if there is a Broadway show in history that was meant to be this great, fantastic thing, everybody thought this next musical from Stephen Sondheim is going to be incredible, just like all his shows leading up to that point. And instead, it had the most tragic, short, 2-week flop of a run. It was a show called Merrily We Roll Along, which I know means a show that means a lot to you. It means a lot to me. I did my senior recital in college in reverse in honor of Merrily We Roll Along. But that show, like I can't imagine how many musicals in history, or how many shows in Broadway history have been described as the Titanic in terms of epic failure. And I'm sure Merrily, I bet there's some newspaper review of Merrily describing it as the Titanic. And a recent revival of Merrily happened in what theater but the Hudson. So it's kind of fun.
It goes back to the parallel between ocean liners and Broadway shows, which is like the high hopes, the high stakes, the like ship of dreams, the show of dreams. Like you're putting so much, it's basically like every Broadway show is like a startup that you've invested all of your energy and all of your money and all of these years in, very similar to like these like incredible, extraordinary ocean liners. So I think that's part of the reason, obviously. But because Titanic became synonymous with like how a large scale disaster kind of like that, I think that's obviously why it gets layered onto Broadway shows. But I think also like, I'm sure we'll talk about this. There's Titanic the musical. There's the current Titanic. I think that the history goes in all different directions. People do have so much respect for, the ambition of what that was as well.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into this next topic. But I'm actually going to do something that regular listeners are going to be so upset about. I have a Patreon, and I save a little bit of bonus testimony for them. So on Patreon, we're going to talk a little bit about the more recent connections with Broadway, the 1997 musical, and other shows that have been based on Titanic. So we'll talk about that in a second. My last question for you, for everybody else to listen to, very simply, if my listeners are ocean liner people, Titanic people, they love the architecture of Titanic and how beautiful these ships were, do you have a theater that you could recommend they Google to just like look up on Google Images? What is the most beautiful interior design of a theater that you've seen?
That's a great question. There's a lot, and a lot are in New York, a lot aren't, and they're beautiful for different reasons. But our oldest still operating as Broadway theaters houses are the Hudson, the Lyceum, and the New Amsterdam. And the New Amsterdam, which, has the history of the Ziegfeld Follies and now is owned by Disney, is like this glorious, gorgeous, also built in 1903, just like stunning theater that you kind of can't believe certain spots in the theater even exist. And I have read, and I haven't proven this, I don't know, I haven't done the research, some of the steelwork for the New Amsterdam happened in the places that the Titanic steelwork might have happened. I've heard that. So I do think there are certain physical elements, even if it's not the exact shipyard, it was being, constructed around that same time in history. And there's a lot of, and this is true of the Hudson too, in the Hudson today, you can see like Henry Harris's old office is still there. There's this physical history in the New Amsterdam and in the Hudson that just throws you all the way back to that first decade in the 1900s.
Spectacular. Well, people, go look up those theaters, and you'll see, they have a similar look, just this extravagance for extravagance sake kind of thing, and they share that with Titanic. That first class passengers on Titanic would have gotten off had they arrived in one piece, and maybe saw a Broadway show the next day, which is pretty cool. Can't thank you enough for joining one last time. The whole point of this is for experts to give their testimony to a brand new inquiry into Titanic. It's lighthearted, but I do take it very seriously, and your testimony was as valuable as any. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this. It's really incredibly important to history.
Thank you very much. I will keep it going as long as I have the energy. And there you have it, folks, the testimony of Broadway historian and expert Jennifer Ashley Tepper. If you would like to hear more from Jen and hear us discuss a bit about the 1997 Broadway musical and some other productions on Broadway that are set on Titanic or are about Titanic, join us on Patreon for a bit of bonus testimony. Big thanks one last time to Jen Tepper for joining. And one last little mention of Randy Bingham. Everyone at Witness Titanic and at Titanic Honor and Glory are very sad to hear the news of his passing. Please, if you can, go look him up, read some of his research sometime today. He did a lot of great work for us to read for years to come. And I hope we can send a little thank you to him wherever he may be. That's it for this episode. Next episode is episode 40. Can you believe it? And next time you hear my voice, I will be sitting in the first class lounge of the Queen Mary, and we will be recording episode 40 in front of a live audience for Titanic Weekend 2026. So I will see you on board the Queen Mary. Thanks for joining us for this episode. Be kind to each other. My name is James Penca. I'll see you next time.